we'll hit it straight up at 6:30. Okay.
Okay.
All right, and we are live on YouTube.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third and final virtual town hall for the Mayor's Commission on Racial Justice and Equality. My name is Renee Shaw. I'm the managing producer and moderator of Kentucky Educational Television's Public Affairs programming. I'm so glad to be here on this trilogy of events. I've been very honored to moderate these discussions and hope the community at large has found a lot of value in the engagement that you've been able to have in these discussions and the responses and the work of the subcommittees that we've had. Tonight, we're talking about housing and gentrification, as well as law enforcement, justice, and accountability. And of course, we urge your questions for you to submit those to townhall@lexingtonky.gov. That's townhall@lexingtonky.gov, all lowercase, all together. We've gotten several questions so far, almost a dozen at this point, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can and take more as time allows. We don't want to delay any further, so I'm going to yield now to one of the co-chairs of the commission, Dr. Gerald Smith, to give tonight's purpose and any other remarks he'd like to make.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, on behalf of Ms. Roz Akins, who also serves as co-chair of the commission, I want to express my appreciation to you, Ms. Shaw, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to moderate our third panel. Of course, the insights and information that you provided in leading these town hall meetings has not only been encouraging, but your presence has greatly enhanced the interest and integrity of what we're trying to accomplish.
Thank you.
We'd also like to thank tonight's panelists, as well as their fellow committee members who worked so hard reading through volumes of material and sorting through those documents in preparation for making recommendations that will come out of their particular subcommittee. For all who are watching this town hall, please know that our purpose, the purpose of the Mayor's Commission for Racial Justice and Equality, is to assemble diverse community members to listen, discuss, and create empowering solutions that dismantle systemic racism in Fayette County. Tonight's town hall will explore the relationships between the city, government, police, judicial system, and neighborhoods from the African-American perspective. It's intended to examine the challenges and conflicts which have historically created a city that is sharply divided along the lines of race and class. But we also want to explore opportunities for creating a spirit of trust, understanding, respect, and compromise. So with that being said, I'm going to turn the meeting back over to you, Ms. Shaw. And again, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Smith, and to Ms. Rosalind Akins, who has been a part of this and your co-conspirator in making sure that all of this runs efficiently and the work gets done. My gratitude to both of you for not just your engagement in this commission, but particularly Dr. Smith, your involvement in making sure we all understand our history and in preserving that. And so thank you for all of your work all year round. And it's a pleasure to be a part of this. I do want to read a statement that the mayor sent that she'd like to have read, and this is quote from her. This is Mayor Linda Gordon, and I want to thank members of the commission for all of your dedication to the work at hand. This is not easy work. I've been watching the subcommittee meetings as well as the previous town hall meetings, and we'll watch tonight's. I understand the difficulty and challenges of what you're committed to doing. Thank you to the members of the public who are watching and participating. This is our opportunity, she says, to make meaningful change for Lexington and all of our people who live here. We must take it now and do it now. And she thanks me for serving the community so well. So thank you, Mayor Gordon, for your kind words and encouragement to keep on keeping on. We, as I said, we've gotten a lot of good questions so far, and we're going to dive into those, but I do want us to kind of set the stage a little bit and have the co-chairs of each of these two subcommittees to just talk about the work that they've been endeavoring in these many weeks and where they are on their recommendations. So I'm going to defer to now for the vice chairs of the Law Enforcement, Justice, and Accountability Subcommittee, the Honorable Jennifer Kaufman, a retired U.S. District Court judge, and then David Cozart, Director of the Lexington Leadership Foundation Fatherhood Initiative. And whoever would like to go first, I yield the floor to you.
I'll begin with just sort of saying appreciative somewhat of this dubious distinction of being a chair. When we met as co-chairs with Dr. Smith and Dr. Akins, all the co-chairs said, thank you so much for allowing us to do this. I expressed the exception that I took for them choosing me for this job because it's some difficulty to it. It's because of the gravitas of the work. The law enforcement, justice, and accountability set forth to obviously adhere to the principles that we've heard Dr. Smith articulate of the super commission or the larger commission. But we also knew from the very beginning we wanted to set an environment, an ethos, a spirit within the committee that would allow for liberty and transparency and forthrightness of our committee members. The cast of members that we have on our committee may be one of the most robust in number, at least, of committees. And we knew that we needed to set that atmosphere. So we began with Judge Kaufman and myself doing some relationship building and exploration, even prior to the meetings. And we brought that spirit into the group. We immediately began also with this principle that the group knew that we were looking at systems and not people. Systems and not people, because we are talking very candidly and sometimes curtly about the systems that are plagued with systematic and systemic racism. And those individuals that are on our group understand that we're looking at something for the community's sake. And the wealth of experience, lived experience, and the education that is on our group is just pretty phenomenal. And it is beginning to manifest into some recommendations that we feel like are going to make some historical changes. So that's how we began, just sort of setting the environment. And I'll let Judge Kaufman share some more.
Judge Kaufman. I think is she frozen to anyone else but me? There she is. Okay.
Okay. Now, is it better?
Yes.
Thank you. Our process has been that we began very early to realize we had a big task. And so we started meeting twice a week, at least. Our big committee meetings were twice a week. We assembled a vast array of documents. We have a shared drive, the public documents on which are available to the public on the lexingtonky.gov website. We are just talking about law enforcement at this point, although we're about to move into the justice component pretty quickly. In addition to meeting twice a week as a subcommittee, we have had some guest speakers on. Dr. Gary Potter from EKU is an expert in the area of law enforcement. He has emailed our committee prolifically from the beginning, and he has spoken to us once. And then we had someone from the Department of Public Advocacy, the state public defender, to come and talk to us yesterday, because Mr. Cozart and I recognized right away that we had no representation of those who represent indigent criminal defendants. We already have assembled some tentative recommendations. We're hard at work. And I have to say, I'm not sure I've ever been on a committee like this where everyone actually does what he or she says that he or she will do. So it's an honor and a privilege to be on this committee. Thank you, Ms. Shaw.
Well, thank you, Judge Kaufman. And we do have quite a few questions about your subcommittee or pertaining to your subcommittee, and we'll get to those in just a moment. Remember, you can submit your questions to townhall@lexingtonky.gov. At this time, I'd like the Housing and Gentrification Subcommittee vice chairs to give us some remarks about the work they've been doing. Shayla Lynch, who's with Ampersand Sexual Violence Resource Center, but has a tremendous background in fair housing and has spent a lot of her career in that realm. And then Ray Sexton, vice chair of this subcommittee with the Human Rights Commission. So Ms. Lynch, I'll let you go first.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Renee and Dr. Smith. It's just been truly an honor and a privilege to do this work that I've been passionate about, spent over 15 years doing in and around the state of Kentucky, and excited to work with Ray. We've been colleagues my entire 15 years, so excited to dive a little deeper onto some of the housing issues and concerns that are prevalent in Lexington. From the jump start, we had a huge task before us, but we're humbled and wanting to do work that the community had a voice in and that we're present in. So we have also had guest speakers during our subcommittee meetings, have gathered lots of data, had some community groups give us information and feedback, which we were very excited to receive. And because of the emphasis of a local community group, we have distributed in partnership with them a community housing survey. So I'm hoping the audience tonight, if you have not had an option to complete that survey, we hope that you do. You can find it on the city's website to give voice and feedback regarding your housing situations that you or your neighbors are experiencing here in Lexington, because we want to make sure that we put forth recommendations that are comprehensive and that really get to the issues that residents are facing here in Lexington. So while it's a big task, we are ready for it and excited to be working with our dynamic subcommittee to find some issues and resolutions that the mayor and the city council can take some immediate action steps on.
Yeah. Mr. Sexton, can you identify some of the major themes that are rising during your conversations and issues that your subcommittee really wants to make some strong recommendations on?
Again, before I get to that, I'd like to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here tonight. And I'd like to thank my co-chair, Shayla Lynch, and member of our committee, Representative George Brown, for agreeing to be with us tonight. And what we decided to do when Shayla and I had our initial first telephone call, it was like, we realized the big task ahead of us. We have a committee that's housing and gentrification, which is very broad, and there's doing research and what you hear on gentrification, there's just so many different kinds of causes and things that go into it. But yeah, we've set about to getting the survey, and we've had a few guest speakers, and some of the common themes are aggressive individuals who like to go into neighborhoods and buy up properties, and at that time there's not a lot of resources for those individuals that are left in the community that have to deal with those after effects. Investment into community, it could be a good thing, but it also has a cause and effect attitude. So we're seeing the lack of adequate resources, whether it be by government programs, maybe an advocate through the city that helps people with housing issues. That's something we had a long time ago that maybe we don't have nowadays as someone dedicated to actually navigate a person through some issues, like what happens when a loved one dies and they're stuck with a property that they don't know what to do with. So we're in the process of trying to figure out what the main themes are and how to best address it moving forward, because like I said, it's a kind of a broad area, and we're looking at some of the better recommendations that we could that may be impactful. And then we're kind of taking the lead, that Dr. Smith and Roz Aikens said is, maybe there are some preliminary things we could do for now, things in the near future, and things that we can project for the farther out that will be good for individuals in the system with this issue. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for kind of setting the stage, and we're going to jump right in. A lot of the questions are about law enforcement, justice, and accountability. And so we do also want to say that the subcommittee's work is a work in progress, and you may not hear every answer that you think you should be hearing tonight, right? We're trying to manage some expectations as they want to do due diligence and making sure that they're gathering the right information, as you've heard, doing a lot of data gathering and aggregation. And so I hope that you can appreciate that as well. This question comes from Tom Bensberg, and it says, quote, "From my limited reading, one of the negative contributing factors to the situation in Ferguson, Missouri is around police revenues. A large percentage of the city's budget was police revenues from fines, parking, etc. Apparently, there was continuing pressure on the department and its officers to continually increase those revenues. As a result, the relationship between police and the community was degraded over time. Is that a problem in Lexington?" Judge Kaufman, if you'll unmute for us, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be glad to take that because it's pretty easy. We are looking at a number of complaints. Some of the themes that have arisen with regard to the police are obviously in the current context, the use of certain practices such as no-knock warrants and chokeholds and strangulation holds. Another emerging theme is citizen involvement in police discipline. Another emerging theme is recruitment and hiring and training of police officers. Also, the 21st Century Task Force on Policing, sort of a best practices idea. Body cameras. And those are current themes, and those are the ones that have risen to the top at first. I will have to say that a pressure to increase police revenues is not something that has risen to the top as a complaint in Lexington. That's not to say we won't look at it, but so far, as you say, it's an organic process and it hasn't come up first.
I do want to introduce the other two panelists that you're seeing on the screen, and I'm sorry that I omitted you earlier. Please welcome. We have Dr. Melinda Price, the William L. Matthews Jr. Professor of Law and Director of the Gaines Center for Humanities, University of Kentucky, and the Honorable George A. Brown Jr., who's serving the State House, District number 77. So thanks to you both. Dr. Price, I did want to get your comments on this because I know that this is a lot of your work, body of work too in this area. So if you can talk to us about put in context for us the events that have led up to all of this. We know that the real touchstone point has been about police and community relations. And I'm interested in knowing, what happened, the 21st Century Policing report and task force that was created under President Obama. What happened to that? Can that be resurrected? And if you remember and can share with us the basic tenets of what that work was trying to accomplish.
So I can give you a rough description of what that work was, mostly a lot of which I have learned through my work with this particular committee. And so, essentially there was a change in priority with the change in administration between President Obama and President Trump, and where they were going to prioritize some of the work that was happening around policing. And what you see with the Obama's task force on 21st century policing was a shift away from the concerns around a sort of militarized style of policing to a different model of policing that was associated with community building and trust, as well as a call to ask law enforcement agencies to acknowledge their any potential role they may have played in creating antagonism with communities of color and other marginalized communities, and how you might move forward in thinking through how you could build better relationships to foment better policing. That can always be picked up. It's either a priority or not a priority of the Department of Justice. But I think what's clear, if you look beyond just the question around this task force that was put in place by Barack Obama, and you look at the national calls for reform-minded prosecutors who won in elections across the country, that what had been a very national discussion around criminal justice reform is coming home to the local, in part because all of the change that has to be made in terms of concerns around the ways in which prosecutors' offices use their power, or law enforcement agencies. Those are bodies that are necessarily a part of local entities, of local governments. They are regulated by municipalities and state laws. And so one could look at the evolution of time, thinking about this with the reigniting of this conversation with the death of Trayvon Martin, which did not involve police. It was not a police involved killing, but the close proximity to a series of events that did involve police officers like Eric Garner and Tamir Rice. And here now, moving forward to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, these things have led us to ask questions around how might we think through or provide some correction for these long concerns around engagement between Black communities and policing. So that was a rather long answer, but I hope it.
That's okay. No, I like long answers. I work in public television for a reason, I guess. And to your point about the militarization of police, and we know that that's part of the Pentagon program. I think it's called the 1033 program, right? Where the surplus arsenal that they have that was part of battling the war on terror is made available to local municipal law enforcement at basically cheap or no cost, right? But that has created kind of a mindset toward, using the words war on terror, war on drugs, that mindset that perhaps is at the Pentagon has infiltrated on the local level, and that may be kind of damaging community relations. Some would say, some scholars I've heard say, because there's a militarization of the local police that not just to serve and protect, but to be in a militarized state of mind with not just, the culture, but the equipment that they have as well, and how that can set up like a tinderbox of fragile relations.
I mean, some of these concerns predate the war on terror. So I'm a transplant to Lexington. I grew up in a large metropolitan area. In Houston, Texas, I lived out in and around the Detroit metropolitan area. And so I grew up right in the midst of the beginning of the crisis around the crack epidemic. And I'm not the only one who has seen local law enforcement use tanks to storm crack houses. So the downgrading of military equipment to local law enforcement is not something that's recent. It's an ongoing practice whenever we see any kind of de-escalation or move from a military front away from that. What do you do with this excess equipment? Mm-hmm. I think that what we're hearing now is a real challenge to the question of, is that the kind of local law enforcement we want? And this committee has had a lot of conversations with Chief Maynard, who is a member of the committee, about the transition from a warrior to a guardian style idea of policing. And they know more about that philosophy than I do. But I do think that there's something very disturbing about viewing a police department to police department to police department in sort of full riot gear or tactical gear that we might see in a war zone being deployed against US citizens. And one could have a debate about whether or not that is justified or not. I would say not, but that would be the side that I would come down on. But it's I think that we are seeing the largest movement of people in the street in mass protests in this country since 1968 or the 1960s. And that is meaningful. And it doesn't just stem from a feeling or just an emotional place, but a recognition that something is out of balance. And I think that visual image provides a very important foil to an understanding of where that balance should be.
Right. And to that point, so James Woodhead asked a series of questions, sir, and I'm sorry we won't be able to get to them all, but he says here, one of them is the Lexington police force has grown substantially in recent years. How do crime statistics compare when LPD had 400 officers compared to over 600 officers now?
So I'll talk a little bit about that. So the Lexington Police Force has been much the same since I have lived here in a little over a decade. But nationally, we have seen an increase in law enforcement agencies in general, although crime is relatively down, including violent crime. And I know that during the pandemic, we have seen there's been reports of an uptick in violent crime, but when taken overall, we are experiencing similar rates of violent crime that were experienced when I was a kid in the 1970s and early 1980s. And so the question I think that we're asking as a committee is not how do we, what is the appropriate size of the police force to deal with the crime that we have, but rather what is the appropriate formation of the police force to deal with questions of public safety writ large. And so in that vein, we have had discussions about diversionary practices, the ability to access rehab for people who are engaged, who are have substance abuse concerns. We've asked questions about whether or not mental health training and those kinds of things. So do we have the police force that we need for the society in which we live in today? And I think that's always an ongoing and important questions that citizens should be asking of law enforcement agencies. You know, do we need, so I may be unique among people on this committee. I don't know if I've ever said this out loud, but I actually graduated from the High School for Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice, which is a real high school in the city of Houston. I have a diploma and everything. And when we were there, it was about preparing people to be lawyers and law enforcement, but all of us had to take the physical skills in gym. There was a wall that we used to try to scale, which was a part of the physical test. So the question we have been asking is, you know, I won't tell you how long ago was I graduated from high school, but it's been a good little while now. But are the skills that we once required for people to be good law enforcement officers decades ago the same skills that we should be requiring now? Or should we be asking for different skill sets in order to deal with the concerns around public safety that we have now, which is tied into the question of whether or not the police should be militarized? And in order to make that transition, I think that we have to have a robust community conversation about how we want that to change.
Well, and to Mr. Kozar and to Judge Kaufman, I want to ask you too, because we've seen some examples in other places where they're actually using social workers. So if you think about all the things that perhaps law enforcement is asked to do, deal with mental health issues and those who have substance abuse disorder issues, and be on the scene and to respond to those situations. One, are they equipped and trained in those areas? And is it possible or feasible for there to be a team approach in those situations where a social worker is accompanying a police officer in those very fragile situations where someone is dealing with a mental health issue or a substance abuse issue, instead of asking the police, as we often ask educators, to put on many different hats for many different situations? Judge Kaufman, I'm interested in hearing what you'd have to say. If you'll unmute, please, ma'am. I know, it's the bedevil of Zoom.
Thank you. Trying to be quiet here. We have talked about this, and we don't have specific recommendations formulated yet on this, but there's a lot of talk about the training that our local police department has done in this area to help with crisis intervention. We're talking, the discussions revolve around what do you do at 3 a.m. when you have a mental health situation? Where do you take people? What if it's a drug abuse situation, or I should say substance abuse situation? Where do you take somebody? So these are definitely areas of interest. We haven't addressed the budgetary considerations, although the report we will pull together will address budgetary concerns. But one thing and Ms. Shaw, you refer to this, one thing some other communities have done is to divert some of the money from the police over to social work agencies. Mr. Cozart, you want to add anything to that?
That's exactly where I would have went. So we're looking at models, not just locally. We're looking at models, community policing models in Massachusetts. We're looking at some of the lessons learned from apartheid. We're looking at emerging practices across this nation, and all seem to point to the appropriate delegation of duties as we're looking at public safety holistically. About revenue, we have a part of the robust glossary of information we pulled is the budget for police, and we disaggregated the budget that they use for training and what sorts of trainings they're doing, and if their trainings actually are able to identify bias, implicit, explicit biases, and or any prejudice that may pre-exist. And so the reconfiguration of the budget that may include, but not be limited to, distribution to human services outside of the police is something that we're looking at. But of course, we know budgets are already lean. The LPD's budget in training and recruitment, when you talk about diversification, some of that has been limited over the years, but we still believe that we have opportunities for growth, such as the documents and the information that we get on the crime, as Dr. Price pointed out. The policing, and this actually goes into gentrification because it's related. When neighborhoods change and cultures, pre-existing cultures in neighborhoods exist, and new cultures come in that don't understand the pre-existing cultures, then we begin to see the disparity against really the indigenous most times when they're Black and brown. And so we have to look at how our officers trained and how's our revenue going towards training in those situations. And the crime reports that we look at, quite frankly, and Dr. Potter accentuated this so well, the crime reports we look at don't tell where crime is happening. It actually tells where we're policing. And so a big difference. And so how do we reconfigure, how do we reform, how do we reassign policing so we can get to some equity, and at every point of discretion in policing or the judiciary system, we don't find Black and brown people being subject to discrimination.
As we've talked on the other two virtual town halls, is there's a lot of intersectionality and the work that you all are doing. And I wanted to try to make that segue a little bit to engage Ms. Lynch and Mr. Sexton too, about Mr. Cozart's point about how housing and neighborhoods also come into the factor of policing and where it's happening. So either one of you care to chime in and weigh in on that point.
I'll just say that David is correct. When neighborhoods change, and when they have been historically an African-American neighborhood, and then there's disinvestment by the city, and commercial businesses change, and there's new property owners, and the neighborhood starts to look a little bit different, then that can, and maybe neighbors are unfamiliar with each other because historically it was an African-American community and everybody knew each other and everybody grew up together, but that starts to change over time. There's a dynamic and a divide that can definitely ensue, which can make for trouble for the African-American residents and neighbors. And unless someone is there to help them advocate, or if they're not advocating on their own, it could be detrimental to that historical neighborhood that was once lively and thriving, but has shifted culturally and commercial businesses wise and everything.
Yeah, Mr. Sexton, you have anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, and we can see it, and you know, in the whole historical context, as the policing and the crime and issues like that are some of the fears and things that get implanted into the existing communities to kind of create perceptions about a community being this way or another. And you know, that's kind of some of the things we look into as far as some of the fears and stereotypes that like investors will use to get people to kind of sell their house for reduce prices in exchange so that they can fix these houses up and charge 5 times more than the house is worth. So certainly those kind of issues do play hand in hand. We've seen it in a historically over the years.
Yeah, Representative Brown, this is an issue in which you're very familiar with, and much of this is happening in the area that you represent, the 77th House District. So what can you tell us?
Well, I'm glad to get in finally. I was sitting here, I was having ants in my pants, and I was really wanting to get in to have something to say about this. And let me start by saying, as I have represented the 1st Council District for 13 years, and this is my 6th year as the state representative of the 77th Legislative House District. And what we have to understand, I think there are 2 Lexingtons, in my opinion. There's south of Main Street, which is white, male, affluent, and educated. North of Main Street is black, it's poor, it's female, and it's riddled with poverty and crime. What occurs, I think, as we've had the conversation about gentrification and housing, and I want to start with gentrification because I think that north of Main Street primarily is where gentrification is happening. And there are people who have financial resources that are moving into the areas north of Main Street. And because they have resources, it is difficult to argue about the investment and to shun it. But what is happening with the investment is that people are being displaced. As Ms. Lynch said about people and cultures and neighborhoods, those are being eroded with no concern about what was there before the people who look to invest come in and do and put their resources in. Secondly, on the housing piece, and we've had a extensive conversation in Fayette County about low to moderate income housing. And I think we got to look to history to understand how we got here. And part of how we got here is 2 things. My friend, Dr. Clark Williams, Reverend Clark Williams says, is that we are only in Fayette County developing about 30% of our land. And what we have with the development of land and or preservation of it is that we have a PDR program that in 1999 came on board. And since 1999, we've looked to preserve, or we've preserved about 30,000 acres of rural land in Fayette County. And we've spent somewhere between $30 to $60 million in preserving those 30 acres. And they're talking about another 20 acres with the PDR program. But the PDR program, there was supposed to be a twin operation. It was supposed to be preservation, and it was also supposed to be infill and redevelopment. And as we have talked about moving forward with what's happening in Lexington, Fayette County, preservation has always won in terms of the debates as to whether we preserve or whether we develop. And I think that where we are at this point has been a problem. I mean, I've been listening in the last couple of years talking about a fair house, a low to moderate income housing fund. And the thing that has happened is that we have funds, but we haven't put funds in it. Because the PDR program, going back to its origination in 1999, said that we would preserve rural land with the purchase of development rights, but we also would do infill and redevelopment. I challenge our administration and our government to talk about what we have put into infill and redevelopment, how much money we put into infill and redevelopment. I know it's $35 to $50 million that has been spent with federal, state, and local dollars in preserving rural land. I don't think we've had anywhere near that investment in low to moderate income housing and into infill and redevelopment. So and one other thing before I close, I think we need to talk about the role, and we've talked extensively about the role of code enforcement in gentrification. And that is a serious problem. So I think that what we have is that we've just pulled the scab, looking to pull the scab off the wound. The wound is very deep, and it's very complex. And I don't think that we can fix this in 90 days of trying to have these committees to talk about it. And the other thing that came out in our conversations was that up until 1955, that African Americans were not allowed or could not borrow money in this community to buy a home or to buy land. And that was systemic racism. And, you know, it perpetuated the redlining aspects that we have in our community. So my cup runneth over. I'm good now. Dr. Smith.
Dr. Gerald Smith, I was going to ask you if you could provide us some historical context, as you did so well when we talked about health disparities last week and racial inequity the week before. I wanted to see, sir, if you had a point you'd like to make in terms of the historical context of redlining. That's where I was going to ask you to pick up, and George eloquently segued us there. If you don't mind unmuting, sir. There you go.
Thank you. Of course, I'm a longtime resident of Lexington. Graduated from Henry Clay High School in 1977, and now I pastor Pilgrim Baptist Church on Jefferson Street, which is seeing the effects of gentrification. But as I look at Lexington, you know, many of the historic Black pockets that were formed in the 1860s and 1870s are still actually in place. But by the same token, they're also being erased. And with that, not only goes the history, but the culture and the collective and historic memory that's a part of those areas. You know, one of the things that I see, obviously, is the impact of traffic within these areas. Not only the development of a number of businesses who are owned by white Lexingtonians, but how that's impacting the community when it comes to traffic, when it comes to policing. There's a certain level of arrogance that also comes with gentrification. And when I say arrogance, as though those who are new to the community, as if they now own the community and have the right and prerogative to behave in a manner that is demeaning and even detrimental to the health of that community. It's quite disturbing. By the same token, I've said this to individuals in several places. The police department has an equine patrol unit, and it always disturbed me that there were police officers riding on horseback in these communities, these historic Black pockets, that reminded me of the slave patrol. And there was some, you know, a lot of celebratory response to the removal of the statue downtown. And as far as I was concerned, you know, John Hunt Morgan was still riding, you know, the streets of Lexington, because when I saw the officers on horseback with helmets and guns and batons and looking down on the Black residents in those communities, it was very reminiscent of what took place in Lexington during the antebellum period, and especially even after slavery. Because the individuals who lived in those communities, you know, were still facing this kind of harassment and intimidation that would go on well into the 20th century. And so when I say unhealthy, because with that equine patrol, you know, you have horses riding down the street, leaving piles of manure. And so what sort of message is that saying to those individuals who live there? You know, it's not only unhealthy, unsanitary, but you know, quite frankly, it is dehumanizing.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, for bringing up that point, because perhaps that cultural competence wasn't considered when the decision was made to have that kind of equine patrol.
Of course, the emphasis was on
back to just, yeah, it's all about the horse industry, right? And how we can somehow once again praise and relish in our history of that without knowing the full extent of our history. So I'm always grateful for you to give us that context. And to those questions about policing and about Reverend Cozart had mentioned, you know, having police where the crime is and not just having over policing where the crime isn't. This person asked, Linda D. Rosette or D. Rose, what does the city of Lexington, or why does the city of Lexington have a police department, a sheriff's department, and a constable whose staff of 5 consists of no people of color? They also say, I've not received a response to my question on Mayor Gorton's recent Facebook post as to whether or not law enforcement officers are allowed to use official vehicles while moonlighting at jobs wholly unconnected to their regular job. So lots of things there, but I think that first point about, is there enough crime to justify a police department by the city, a sheriff's department, and a constable? And is there some restructuring, Judge Kaufman, that should take place to get at people's concerns about over policing?
Well, first of all, with regard to the structure, you know, we have the sheriff on our committee, and we have Deputy Chief Maynard on our committee. And we have not talked about whether the sheriff is necessary. I think if we got into that, we would find that a lot of the sheriff's duties have to do with property taxes and other things. For example, with regard to the composition of the police department, we haven't gotten to the constable. That really hasn't come up. We have talked about the composition on the police department, and before this ever started, Mr. Cozart and I talked with the chief, Chief Weathers, just to get some context here, to try to get our arms around this beast, because it is a big issue. And we asked him whether percentages have improved, and whether we have more Black police officers, whether we have more, you know. He said one of the reasons that we started this whole move toward the guardian as opposed to the warrior mentality was to attract more minorities and women. And one of the questions we had is, has it done so? Mm-hmm. And do we have more women and minorities in the supervisory ranks? And, you know, the long and short of it is no, we don't. Now, he is a person of color. Excuse me. He's a person of color, but the numbers are really not that great. And they're, you know, they have reasons for that. I mean, one of the things the chief said is that, you know, people get comfortable in their jobs and they don't really want to apply for higher jobs. But we've heard those there are not enough people in the pool arguments before, haven't we? So, but in terms of, do we have enough to justify police, constable, and sheriff? We haven't gotten to that, but I'm sure it'll come up at our next meeting. We actually, at our next guest speaker meeting will be Monday, the 10th. Now, this Thursday, what's that, the 6th? We have just the committee there, no guest speakers, and we're going to talk about the recommendations that came forward from Dr. Potter from EKU, starting with the Citizen Review Board, because we already, Diane Minifield, who's on our committee, made a substantial recommendation, and we're working through that right now. But the next meeting, we're going to have the FOP and the City Law Department talk about collective bargaining and about the FOP itself. And, you know, it's part of the system too, as Mr. Cozart said. This is about systems, not people, and systemic racism. But in terms of the part of the system that says, do we really need sheriff, constable, and police? We haven't gotten there, but I think it'll probably come up pretty soon.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in on that before I go to the next question? This is for, go ahead, Dr. Price.
I think a lot of the reasons we have these overlapping law enforcement jurisdictions are historical. And I don't know that anyone has really asked the question of what is the necessity of these various agencies. And if you think about those people who live close to the University of Kentucky, people who live close to Transylvania, some of them are also under the jurisdiction of the UKPD and other safety officers. So there's lots of overlapping law enforcement jurisdictions. And it is very hard to undo a public agency once it has been created. But I think raising the question may be beyond the scope of what we can do, but is a really important one, I think, for citizens to continue to ask of their elected officials.
I agree.
Thank you.
Renee, I would add in reference to the police, diversity, sheriff, and constable's office, and the lack of diversity or growth opportunities in diversity there. Again, we have looked at all of the staffing and looking at diversity of LPD specifically, and asked their recruitment budget and methods and areas that they're recruiting in. I'll dare not try to be a historian here with Dr. Smith and others around, but in a community where policing began in the 1700s to capture slaves in the South, and in the 1800s to regulate immigration in the North, minorities don't have a proclivity to go into such a vocation because of some historic reasons. But even those that are there, I will say the police department has articulated and shown some intentionality about trying to advance inside the police department, those that are there. But just like economic equity and that subcommittee are not accepting that we don't have the folks to do the work. We don't have diverse contractors. We're not accepting, we cannot accept that we don't have the pool of people. We will be continuously recommending and urging and demanding that we seek at all costs more diverse representation, because they will be those from the community, that BIPOC community we're continuing to urge recruitment.
Yeah.
Can I add one thing, Renee?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Also important to recognize that it's not just simply the recruiting of Black and brown faces in police departments. If you look at cities with large minority populations, we can always point to the fact that Lexington has a very low population of African Americans. We still see the same systemic inequities in terms of the treatment of people of color by police officers. So it has to be more than just bringing in Black and brown faces, but a real cultural shift around how you police these communities that has to go hand in hand. And we will be hopeful that that would mean more women and more people of color would police communities of color differently, but we don't really have strong sort of data to say that those systemic inequities that we see would change drastically if we were to come up with a police force that was overwhelmingly people from those.
Right. Maybe the approach would change, Dr. Price, but not overall system change, you're saying.
So, but the dynamics of the organizational dynamics lead to outcomes. And so the ways in which we have talked about recruitment and training, I think has to focus on that it has to be an organizational change and not just the replacement of people in an organization that has shown a inclination towards discrimination against one group. All officers are trained together in the same culture of policing. And so we want to make sure that we have a transition, that we don't just populate the same police department with Black and brown faces, but continue to move forward in how we think about how policing itself could be improved to better deal with these inequities.
And Dr. Price has actually, I thought she was going there. Dr. Price has actually given the committee an article about a study that was done by Stanford University about the Oakland Police Department, and it involved body cameras on police officers. And just long story short, it analyzed the interaction between police officers and the people with whom they come in contact and looked at the quality of that contact. For example, were people of color treated with more or less respect than people who are white? And one of the recommendations we already have on the table, and I don't know if it'll make the final cut, but we already have on the table to do a similar analysis in Lexington of that body camera footage. And I know this one's on there because I made it, to also have coaching with the body camera footage, showing police officers how their interactions do or do not connote respect.
Right, yes. And there have been some questions about body camera footage, why cameras are turned off in certain situations, the accessibility of that body camera footage to the public. So I know you're working through the myriad of questions regarding that use. This email from Dr. Shambra Mulder, and she's referencing Dr. Potter, who Judge Kaufman, I think you referenced earlier. So at the end of that Zoom meeting with Dr. Potter, she says at EKU, she was intrigued with the discussion about, quote, discretion, and someone mentioned that it's the reason for race inequities. What concerned me, she says, is the point Dr. Potter was making was missed, which was that one could be more aware of racial bias and racist policies to use reasonable judgment or discretion to avoid perpetrating white supremacy and racial inequities. He mentioned that this discretion should be used by citizens in deciding to call the police when it's not warranted or no crime is being committed. He mentioned that police could use discretion in using de-escalating skills during contact with citizens and avoiding arrests. Prosecutors could use discretion when deciding what charges to bring forward. Judges could use discretion in sentences. So Judge Kaufman, do you want to pick up her stream of consciousness there?
You know, we also have, Dr. Price and I were the ones talking about discretion at the end of Dr. Potter's talk. And this came up in another context yesterday, no, I guess Monday at our meeting when we had the state public defender, Mr. Damon Preston. And one of the things he talked about was that at every single inflection point, every single decision point in the system, from a police officer saying, should I approach this person? Should I do a license? Should I stop this car? At every single decision point, there is discretion present. There are human choices being made. And the points, there were related points that the public defender made, Mr. Preston made. One was that every single person, I don't know if he used these words, but he started with judges. And he said one thing that has to happen is that judges need to question, is this case really a felony? Should this have been charged this way? But I took the implication on a broader level, and that is that every single guardian of the system, police, prosecutor, judge, attorney, has to be responsible, has to be a guardian to say, is there racism involved? Do we need to do it this way? And so I think that subsumes part of that question. In fact, Ms. Shaw, I think it would help the committee if you would send that email to us.
Sure.
Yeah, we would really like to see that. I think the idea here is that discretion would be exercised wisely, but also not in a racist way, and that each person within the system would think about the implications of the interaction with the police, the charging decision made by the prosecutor, the interaction between police and prosecutor if the prosecutor is thinking about resolving a case. One example the DPA gave yesterday, Mr. Preston gave yesterday, was he has heard a police officer say to a prosecutor who's thinking about dropping a charge or reducing a charge, well, what am I doing out there? Am I just doing this for nothing? And he said, once a charge is in the system, the pressure is applied at every point to keep it in the system. So that may not exactly address the questioner's question, which, as I said, I would really like to see, but we are examining an array of these things from Dr. Potter's perspective and from the perspective of the justice system and writ large.
All right.
Sister Shaw, I would let me read that list of points of discretion, and this is it's not, maybe not even the whole list, but from beginning to end, it's suspected that BIPOC, but Black, Indigenous, people of color are suspected when others are not, approached and stopped when others are ignored, searched often forcibly when others are simply not, charged when others are given a warning, violently arrested when others are cited and released, jailed and detained when others are given diversion, convicted when others are dismissed, made felons when others are given misdemeanors, sent to prison when others are probated, and killed when others live. There was just a sort of a list of the discretions, and those are systemic issues. I think it was Audre Lorde that said, can we use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house? And so these are the sorts of questions that we're asking in a system where these points of discretion are there, because we don't necessarily want to say discretion needs to go away, that latitude needs to go away, but the individuals that are exercising discretion need to do it in a favorable way, equitably, and not an unfavorable way, inequitably. And you can't really legislate that. So
That's right.
it's a real issue.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Reverend Cozart. April Taylor has sent in a few questions, and we want to also just mention that we know that you all are still working through this, so you may not have all the answers to these questions, but there are lots of questions about the FOP's role, what policies prevent officers from being immediately fired for use of force instead of receiving at most a 6-month suspension, the loophole that allows administrative officers to not wear body cameras while interacting with public in an on-duty capacity. Why are so many use of force complaints determined to be unfounded? These types of questions. What data suggests that we shouldn't permanently ban no-knock warrants and implement Breonna's law? So there's a host of these that I know that you all, that she's articulated here in this email that I'll be glad to forward as well, that I know you all are considering when it comes to no-knock warrants or quick knock warrants, right? Because in Louisville, that ordinance that was passed and signed by Mayor Fisher also addressed quick knock. That is that you give how many 5 to 10 or 15 seconds before you can take the battering ram and go in. So all of that, I'm assuming that you all are considering in a large capacity, correct?
Right.
Instead of taking these one by one, I just want to try to do a patchwork with them if we can, since we
I
have so many.
appreciate that, Ms. Shaw. And we have some of those questions, but again, I think it's very important that we get to see these questions as we continue to consider it, because you're right, those are the directions in which we're going.
Right.
Let me say that when we get questions as part of our process, and I believe we received several of April's questions, we do distribute those to the committee,
Right.
make those available and take those into consideration, even if an explicit response is not given to each question from citizens. And I would also add that this committee is very intentional about keeping a high consciousness of citizens' requests and either pre-existing or ongoing efforts that are related to the issue of law enforcement, justice, and accountability. So for instance, Judge Kaufman keeps before us the Black faith leaders of Lexington and the vicinity, and their very salient and well thought out list of demands to not only the Urban County government and the mayor, but also University of Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, Fayette County Public Schools, and others. We also take into account the good work of NAACP and other organizations. We take into account the work of those that have been participating in and or leading the peaceful protests. So this collective impact approach is what this committee is doing.
Right. And there are several questions about when officers have engaged in misconduct and being allowed to retire or resign instead of being fired and still receiving their pensions. The collective bargaining, Judge Kaufman, as you alluded earlier, and also I haven't seen this question yet, but I'm sure it's in the pile, about the force, I shouldn't say the force, but about the influence and impact of police unions. And where all of that fits in, even perhaps with collective bargaining, but all these other misconduct rules. And so there is a question about, would you recommend, I'm going to rephrase it, they didn't phrase it this way, but would you recommend reducing the police budget and putting that money into something that helps the community in a nonviolent way? And this is a take on a question that was sent from Miss Cassandra Lyons. So is that something that you're considering? You alluded to it earlier. Is this something you've been studying, but do you think that it's feasible to propose such a recommendation, knowing that that may or may not be embraced by a larger governing body? Is that on your list?
Dr. Price, you want to address that?
You haven't made an official, I don't think there's an official proposal to reduce the police budget. But I do think, and I also wanted to mention, because you listed the questions by April Taylor, to say that we have the very thorough and robust documents from Cooperation Lex. And I think one of the things that they have laid out over the years, and what we are also seeing, is the very complex both state laws in Kentucky that make it very difficult, and the collective bargaining agreements that make it difficult for any kind of intervention into the way in which things are working now. And so our next guest speaker is actually going to be from the FOP and the city attorney's office to begin to ask questions about these agreements. And we have been asking questions internally to make sure that we have a clear interpretation of our own about how these statutes work. So
Yeah. When is that? I'd like to see that. That's Thursday?
No, that's
Monday the 10th.
Monday the 10th.
Monday the 10th.
And
Yes.
all of our archive, just in case you can't catch them live, you can always go back and view them because I'd love to see that. But I'm a little busy on Monday nights at 8 at KT. So there's a question.
Question about resources. One of the things that we are consistently told in every budgetary year, be it at the local or the state level, is that resources are finite. So if you want to emphasize or create more public safety programs, the money has to come from somewhere. And if that money could be seen or is understood as a possible way to reduce some of the inappropriate burden of the police department, and it is a more efficient and effective use of those dollars to help in public safety in our community, then the mayor, I think, should be called upon to reallocate those funds where they are most effective for the community. The budgets for local police departments are a significant proportion of almost every municipal budget, not just ours. This is true across the country. And in this period of austerity, where we know on top of when you add in the coronavirus, that we are all going to be required to make budget cuts for various reasons, we think that a rethinking of how we use our public safety dollars is the best way. And if that means a reduced allocation to police officers in favor of something that might be a more effective strategy, then I think that that is the kind of calculation that the city should be willing to make, right? So we cannot get away from the idea that every good program costs, and that where we have finite resources and budgeting decisions are made should be made on the effective use of community dollars, not the traditional way in which we have funded city agencies.
And Dr. Price, to that point, one of the barriers to that conversation even happening in local body governments is the political will, right? And if you're considering such a proposition during an election year, the chances of that happening, as I've been taught, slim and none, and Slim's not even in town. So I think that's probably a larger barrier to the reality of such a proposition. I want to segue now, because I know we spent a lot of time on law enforcement and criminal justice, and it's really, really, really important, and we don't want to give short shrift to housing and gentrification. So I am going to turn there and ask a few questions that we have received, and then we'll come back around to the other if we need to. I don't have a name on this particular question, but these are some good ones. Has the Housing Committee looked at the policy of cities' affordable housing? And if so, what are they seeing as the barriers? And is the committee looking at who the term affordable housing benefits? Shayla or Ray? And Representative Brown.
We have looked at a lot of documentation, I will say, about housing affordability in the city. And as Representative Brown made mention of before, and we've talked about it at subcommittee meetings, there needs to be dedicated monies for affordable housing because the demand is high, but the stock is very short for housing, period, in Lexington. And when you add on the word affordable, word safe and decent, it shrinks even more. And so the need for a strong, dedicated funding stream to the Affordable Housing Fund and make it an Affordable Housing Trust Fund so that the money's there to build housing that is safe, decent, and affordable for folks is very much needed. And we've talked about that and we have that on our working list of recommendations that we're working through. Because there's a severe lack of that in Lexington.
Right. And before you answer, Mr. Sexton and Representative Brown, I wanted to get in this comment from Angela Claiborne. Ask, where is the affordable housing and why are the decent houses so high since you have to make 3 times the rent for certain rental companies. If I made 3 times the rent, I would be buying a house. She says, not renting a house. Also, what does your race or background have to do with renting a house? She's just confused. So Representative Brown and Mr. Sexton, I'll let you respond along with making your other comments.
Therein is I think a large part of the problem, that we have a pool and resources to pay in funds for affordable housing in Fayette County. It's just a matter of our choosing to do it. If we take money that we're spending on PDR and for preservation and put into infill and redevelopment, the money is there. I don't know. I think there ought to be conversations from that perspective. The council has had conversations about not having enough funds for an affordable housing fund. I don't think that's there. I think what we have to do is develop the will.
And you're saying shift that money from the PDR program to affordable housing initiatives.
I'm not talking about shifting. I think that people will have a problem with shifting. What we need to do is what we were first intending to do with PDR, and that is to do infill and redevelopment. We have not put money into infill redevelopment. We put all the money into preservation in terms of the PDR program.
Yeah, Mr. Sexton.
Yes, ma'am. And my cohorts explain it eloquently, but you know, you mentioned with respect to the police budgets is the city's budget, and as you see, and as Shayla mentioned, what we're kind of looking at is how do we get at a dedicated. We got the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is a great, but it's subject to budget cuts as it was this year. You know, that was one of the first things that was recommended, and so we need to move toward getting a dedicated funding stream for that. And as far as affordable housing as a whole, you know, all our conversations, many of our conversations we've had in our committee meetings, as well as the individual that has spoken to us, is it all comes back to affordable housing. So a lot of the looking into things that we've done is revolving around affordable housing, and hopefully race would never come in, you know, as a director of the Human Rights Commission, should not be coming into a housing decision, whether it be a rental or a sale situation. So I hope individuals would know to contact the Human Rights Commission or HUD to file a complaint. But yeah, you know, we're wrestling with those issues. You know, we're trying to get to a point where we have a good list of recommendations, but it's such a vast thing. When every time we meet, more things get put on the table. So our duty is to vet all these and figure out which ones will be the best, the most impactful recommendations to make. But yeah, affordable housing is going to be a big part of a lot of the things that we recommend.
So as I'm just listening to the wish list, I don't mean to demean what your recommendation is to be a wish list, but I'll just call it that for the sake of having a lexicon for it. One of the questions that comes to my mind, and Dr. Price mentioned it, you know, that in this COVID era, the budgets are going to be tight from all levels of government. So I'm just curious, and we talked about political will, but do the subcommittees also have the will to propose tax increases to help fund, whether it's affordable housing or whether it's and investing in community policing, or however you define it? Will that be a part of your recommendations? Because if you make the recommendations, should you also not recommend ways for it to be paid for?
I think that's always a concern, but I think it takes political will on the part of the bodies, whether it's local, state, or federal, to make the decisions that are necessary for.
So you make, as the subcommittee, will you make the recommendation for them to even consider?
I would. I think it's something that needs to be made. I mean, we spend all the money that we spent on preservation by way of the PDR program, but then we don't have money in some people's minds for affordable housing and the affordable housing fund. It doesn't make sense. I think that we have to put that out there as a recommendation and put it into the report, and then we'll deal with that. But I think that if we never ask, the answer is always no.
Right. Judge Kaufman, I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say and others. You know, the same thing happened with making more robust school safety measures. in Fayette County, right? And so if we're willing to do it in that aspect, is this also not worth the investment from the community, since it's about the community, of a tax increase?
We just today, I may have mentioned this earlier, I mentioned it at some meeting today, and I think it was tonight. We have seen a template, thank you for that, Dr. Smith, for the report we are to make. And one of the things we are to consider is budgetary impact. And we will also address whether legislative changes need to be made. And if we, you have to set some priorities here. And we are looking, and someone just mentioned, I guess it was Representative Brown, every time you start talking about this, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. At some point, you have to set some priorities. And the mayor said to us, let's try to do this within 90 days. Now, there may be some flexibility in there, but it's too important to go much beyond 90 days. But what she also said to us in our very first meeting is, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. And I think that's a very important, that's Mr. Cozart and I have reminded each other of that, as well as the mantra, this is about systems and not people. So we will look at budgetary impact. We will look at, if we think it's important enough, if it gets high enough on our priority list, we will recommend a tax increase. We haven't gotten to that point yet. We will also recommend lobbying for a legislative change if we think it's important enough. But at some point, we have to be results oriented, and we have to have a list together that sets some priorities. And so that's all I can say right now. We don't have our final list together.
Yeah, thank you for that. I will remind you that you can submit questions. We've gotten through quite a few, but we have a few minutes, about 15 minutes left to take a few more. You can send your questions to townhall@lexingtonky.gov. That's townhall@lexingtonky.gov. Anybody else want to chime in on how much capital you will expend on making perhaps unpopular recommendations on how to bridge all of these gaps, whether it's housing, law enforcement, public safety, et cetera? Mr. Cozart, Dr. Price.
So I don't know how much capital I have in terms of the political infrastructure of Lexington, but to some degree, that actually makes us, I think, more effective. I mean, I could say that I would not want to pay more taxes to increase the budget of the Lexington Police Department, given its outsized proportion in our existing municipal budget. Now, if you would say an increase in taxes to create the establishment of broader mental health services by the city that worked in cooperation with the police, perhaps. But some of the reforms that we have been in discussion about really are related to the very practices of the police department itself, which unlike the scenario that Representative Brown has laid out and Ms. Lynch and Mr. Sexton, have a significant portion of city resources already. And I think the question is then, how do we make this organization that already has a significant portion of resources more effective and responsive to the people whom they police? So whatever political capital I have, I'm willing to expend it, I think, for what are good suggestions that will come out of the committee. But I think it's also important that the mayor who commissioned us to make these suggestions takes them up. And then the question will really be, how much are the elected officials willing to put on the line? And that's how the democratic process works. And if they don't take up these recommendations, which we have tried to be responsive to community calls for change, then the democratic process also says that maybe those people should not hold those positions. And so I think that's the only cycle we have. John Lewis just died, and he talked about the responsibility we all have to make democracy a reality. And that's sort of what we are working in, a cycle of putting forth what we think will be good recommendations for our community. We all live here. We all are citizens. We all want to live in a community that's more equitable, more fair, and more just. And if the people who we have elected don't tend to agree with our vision of that, then that's where democracy comes into play.
We were asked at one time if we should just make recommendations as a committee that the mayor could do within the parameters and the purview and her jurisdiction. If we should only make recommendations that our local council could address. And we swiftly went back to the origin of this commission. And it is designed to make recommendations that will get at the mitigation, hopefully the amelioration of systemic and systematic racism that is a disease that is plaguing us. So we will be making recommendations that may involve some seeking or reallocation of revenue. We'll be making realistic recommendations, but they may involve some budgetary reform locally and at other levels. Representative Brown knows the numbers locally better than I. He's been intimate with them when he was a council member. Now he's intimate with them at a state level. Our checkbook and our calendar, that's what we care about, right? That's what we follow to figure out what we care about. If we care about this issue, we'll adjust our checkbook. He mentioned them earlier. Reverend Clark Williams said something very important, I think, when asked about the cost of mail-in ballots and his response to how do we deal with those costs. His response was, there's no cost too great when democracy's at stake. I would augment that there's no cost too great when equity is at stake, when quality of life for Black and Brown individuals are at stake. So we'll make recommendations in the spirit of Desmond Tutu that said, I'm not interested in picking up the crumbs from someone that thinks they're compassionate that are thrown from the table. He said, I want the full menu of rights. And we want the full menu. We don't want the crumbs. So we'll make recommendations for the full menu of rights.
Representative Brown, since you were referenced in many of Reverend Cozart's remarks, I'll let you pick it up from there.
I think it's all about choices. As we talk about budget, as we think about who deserves and who needs the services, that there are people then in our community that need the services. We need policing. We're not talking about there not being policing and not having police in our communities, but we're talking about having police that are sensitive and compassionate about the neighborhoods in which they serve. We're talking about making funds available that we can make the hard choices to do the right thing. It's not in this community a hard thing for people to talk about preservation and put money and their strength behind that. We have got to say the same thing about affordable housing, is that we've got to put our strength and our energies and our compassion and our understanding to ensure that we don't say that we don't have money to have the affordable housing fund. That's not, I mean, that should not be a part of the conversation, that we've got a problem in this community. And that's one of the first things I said when I came on the committee, is that we have to first recognize that gentrification and affordable housing is a problem. And I'm hoping that that's a part of what we're going to have in terms of our recommendations. I certainly recommended that on the front end, but I think if you don't recognize the problem and face it, you can't address it.
Yeah. So is the subcommittee on housing and gentrification, have you engaged those developers who've come into those areas thinking that they are helping elevate a blighted community in the name of urban renewal? Because they may not consider that it's displacing folks who've been in those communities for tens of years or hundreds of years. That may not come across as just the ability to free enterprise, could be their main motivation. So are you engaging the people who are actually doing, quote unquote, the alleged gentrification?
We have not had any investors to come to speak to us. We've mostly had the people that live in those neighborhoods that feel like they are the victims of those investors. Our subcommittee was very vocal about wanting to hear stories about what people are facing as a result of the investors. Because we are all kind of familiar with what the problem is, and that this investing is happening in these neighborhoods and are driving up long-term residents who've been there, driving up their property taxes because of the new additions to the neighborhoods. And so we've mostly heard from the neighborhoods, the people that live in the neighborhoods and what they've been facing with, because we kind of know what's going on with on the investor side. We kind of know that. So we have not had them. If they're interested in speaking with us, we are more than welcome to have them to come and speak with us at a subcommittee meeting. But we've mostly been hearing from neighborhood residents and what their experiences have been.
Going back to our previous conversation when it came to policing, this comes from Janie Lewis, who says, talking about the community paramedicine program. She says it already exists in Lexington, social worker plus paramedic plus police officer. I'm sure the committee knows about this existing program, yet she's not heard about it here tonight. She says, as a director of a local nonprofit, I've personally seen the effect this program has had already in the Lexington community. This is an amazing and invaluable program. She says that in its pilot stage, and needs to be expanded. So Judge Kaufman, I see you nodding your head. You're aware of it, even though we haven't spoken much about it tonight.
We are. Thank you, Ms. Shaw. And that's a good question. And I'm glad she reframed what I said. When I mentioned crisis intervention earlier, that was a broad term. But yes, we have been told about the paramedicine program. And I should say, we've gotten just a trove of information from the Lexington Police Department. And every time we ask for something, they will query the system and give us all the statistics we need. Sometimes they can't, but that's the fodder of recommendations, isn't it? But when I mentioned crisis intervention, I was speaking generally. That paramedicine program does get rave reviews, and they are trained police officers. Chief Weathers thinks that police officers are a little bit social worker, and this is part of that whole initiative.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Judge Kaufman. We did have a question about revisiting April Taylor's questions, and we're going to submit those because those had some volume to them, and we want the subcommittee to thoroughly vet those, not in the 5 minutes we have left tonight.
Thank
and
you.
So we'll allow you time to do your due diligence. But a good question that did come in, a follow-up from Alicia Katara. What can we expect? When can we expect actions to be taken from these committee and subcommittee meetings? So that's a good question to maybe kind of narrow out our time tonight. What is the timeline for your recommendations and the submission to the mayor, and then the process from there on? And this may be also where Dr. Smith can chime in as well.
Yes, I'll take that question. Initially, we were looking at August the 31st. We have been given an extended time frame to work in, but all of the committees are aiming toward August the 31st, at least to have their recommendations to myself and Ms. Akins. From that point, we'll begin to compile the report. Actually, this morning, we sent the vice chairs a template in terms of how we would like the report of each subcommittee to look. And so they have that template, and we'll continue to work on that. But ideally, we're looking at sometime probably mid-September when we have everything completed. And of course, that will include all the recommendations that comes out of each of the subcommittees.
And then from that point on, is there a timeline by which the mayor is expected to act and to forward on to the city council?
Well, we have weekly meetings with the mayor, myself and Ms. Akins. And how we've outlined it to each subcommittee is that there's some recommendations that will require immediate action from the mayor. Some will require some council action. Some other recommendations might even include a partnership of some sort. And then obviously there are budgetary issues that will be reflected in those recommendations. So we're just sort of pacing ourselves here, not getting ahead of anything or anybody, allowing each subcommittee to do their work. From that point on, Ms. Akins and I will synthesize that material, of course, frame it up and provide a narrative as well as a conclusion from the work of the commission.
So in the 3 minutes we have remaining, I'll do a round robin and let you all just give us some final takeaways and things that you're thinking about, and maybe that you've even garnered from this conversation that will be considered in your conversations going forward. We'll start with you, Dr. Price. I'll just go in the motion of my screen here.
I was just about to thank Gerald Smith for asking me to be on this committee, but I'm not sure. I'm not ready for thanks just yet. I'll let you know on brand how well it goes. You know, we have had so much information about body worn cameras, about camera footage, about use of force, spectrums of force, that is almost overwhelming. But I would like to think that, or at least I feel like the people on the committee have taken up seriously the questions that have been put before us and those requests that the community has asked for, which is that there be more civilian participation in the ways in which we create ways in which we have our public safety infrastructure right now, which is largely taken up by the Lexington Police Department. So I just hope that at least the people who that I know and I'm in community with, and all those citizens who I don't know that we are doing our very best to think about what are really, really gross inequities in the ways in which Black people, other people of color, poor people find themselves entangled in the criminal justice system. And that begins necessarily with a conversation about policing and other safety measures that other committees like Representative Brown and Ms. Lynch and Mr. Sexton are taking up about safety and security for all citizens in Lexington, and not just a sort of standoff between those people who either believe in the police or don't.
Yeah. And in the interest of time, I won't be able to do the complete round robin. So I'm going to ask someone from the subcommittee on housing and gentrification if you will share with us parting words about the work going ahead in your committee going forward.
Well, I think when we all got the call, we realized to be on this committee, we all realized what was at stake and the seriousness of the issue, and the eyes that would be on us and the feedback we would be getting. And kind of like in Shayla and I's first conversation together, it's like, okay, this feels like an uphill battle. It's insurmountable. And we're like, so we agreed that it's like the old adage is, how do you eat an elephant? And it's one bite at a time. So that's kind of what we're trying to do here. And when somebody in our committee said that our recommendation should match the seriousness of the issue, and I think the consensus of our committee is, if you're not afraid to make hard-hitting, radical suggestions, then you probably weren't going to be on this committee anyway. So I think our job is just to, we got a preliminary list, and moving forward, we encourage the community to still, a lot of people may not have had their questions read tonight, but they know how to get in touch with us. And we said from the beginning is we're very interested in what the people have to say about it, because we represent them, and we'll get through this. We'll get through this together and make the recommendations we need to make Lexington a better place.
Yeah, we'll all get through this together is a common refrain we've heard a lot in the last few months. So to Gerald Smith and in her absence, Ms. Rosalind Akins, thank you guys for your leadership on this issue, and thank all of the subcommittee vice chairs who've been a part of these discussions and this work, and all of the team members that have supported the subcommittees. Thank you all. We never have enough time, even though an hour and a half sounds like a lot of time. I do appreciate you all engaging your community, and you can probably still send your questions to townhall@lexingtonky.gov if you still have them, and we're going to forward some on, Judge Kaufman, to you that I know are of particular high interest. So my name is Renee Shaw. It's been a pleasure being with you these last few nights, and let's just all hang in here together and do the right thing for all of us. And we know that's the goal of everyone who's been a part of these meetings and on these subcommittees. So thank you all. Please be safe, wear your mask, and God bless. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye.